Why silence hurts more than words. Silence doesn't hurt because it's quiet. It hurts because it leaves you alone with your imagination. With words, at least there's something to grab onto. Even cruel words give your mind a shape. You can fight them, reject them, tell yourself they're wrong. Silence gives you nothing, and the human mind panics in empty space. When someone says something harsh, the pain lands, then stops. But when someone says nothing, your mind keeps falling. You replay the last conversation, the last message, the last moment things felt normal. You zoom in on details that probably didn't matter. A pause, a delay, a tone you might have imagined. And slowly, almost invisibly, your mind turns silence into a verdict. Not, they're busy. Not, they don't know what to say. But, I did something wrong. I mattered less than I thought. I wasn't worth the effort. That's why silence hurts more than words. Rejection says, no. Silence says, you don't even deserve an answer. And that distinction cuts deeper than people admit. Because rejection still acknowledges your existence. Silence questions it. That's why silence lingers. Why it replays at night. Why it tightens your chest hours later when nothing else is happening. You're not just missing a person. You're missing confirmation. Confirmation that you mattered. That you weren't invisible. That the connection you felt was real. And when that confirmation doesn't come, your mind starts searching, not outward, inward. It scans your behavior, your tone, your timing, your words. It rewrites the story with you as the problem. And this is where silence becomes dangerous. Because silence doesn't just create pain. It creates stories. Stories where you were too much, or not enough, or easily replaced. And those stories feel true because there's nothing to contradict them. Words can be challenged, silence cannot. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. The pain of silence is rarely about the other person. It's about what silence presses on inside you. Silence doesn't create insecurity. It presses on the bruise you thought had healed. It wakes up the part of you that learned early on that attention could disappear without warning. The part of you that remembers looking up and not being seen. A child waiting for a parent to turn around in a grocery store aisle, not abandoned, just unnoticed, long enough for panic to set in. So when someone goes quiet now, your body doesn't respond like an adult. It responds like a memory. Your chest tightens before you think. Your stomach drops. Your thoughts speed up. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system recognizes the pattern. Silence feels familiar, and familiar pain is the hardest to ignore. That's why silence doesn't just hurt. It unsettles you. It makes you feel unanchored, like you're standing in a room where someone turned off the lights without warning, and you keep waiting. For the sound, for the signal, for anything to prove you still exist in their mind. But here's the truth. Most people never say out loud, the part of you that suffers most in silence is not the part that wants answers. It's the part of you that learned to measure its worth by being responded to. And until you see that clearly, silence will always feel heavier than any words ever could. Because silence isn't just absence. It's a mirror. And what it reflects is something most people aren't ready to face. That's where this goes next. Silence becomes unbearable when your sense of value depends on being echoed. That's the part people avoid admitting, because it's easier to say, they hurt me by ignoring me, than to say, I learned to feel real only when someone reacts to me. But silence doesn't steal your worth. It exposes where you handed it away. When someone goes quiet, the pain doesn't come from the absence of sound. It comes from the question that follows. What do I mean if no one is answering? That question hits hardest if your nervous system learned early on that attention equals safety. If love came inconsistently, if care arrived and vanished without explanation, if silence once meant being left alone with feelings you didn't know how to hold, then silence now doesn't feel neutral. It feels like danger returning, so your body reacts before your mind can catch up. You don't just think something is wrong. You feel wrong. Your shoulders tense, your breathing shortens. Your thoughts race ahead, already preparing for loss. That's why logic doesn't help, why reassurance doesn't stick, why even kind explanations feel thin. Because this isn't about the present moment, it's about an old alarm being triggered by a familiar absence. And here is the shift that changes everything. Silence hurts most when you believe it says something about you, about your importance, your replaceability, your value. But silence often says far more about the other person's capacity than your worth. People go silent because they avoid discomfort, because they don't know how to articulate what they feel, because conflict overwhelms them, because shutting down feels safer than speaking. Silence is not always a verdict. Sometimes it's just someone else's limitation. But if your mind doesn't know the difference, it will always assume the worst. Because uncertainty plus self-doubt creates a perfect storm. That's why silence makes you chase clarity. You reread messages, check timestamps, replay moments. You're not obsessive. You're trying to restore certainty. Because certainty feels like safety, and safety is what silence removes. But here's the hard truth that actually gives your power back. If silence destroys you, it's not because you care deeply. It's because your sense of self is still leaning on other people's response. Caring isn't the problem. Attachment isn't the problem. Dependency is. And dependency doesn't mean weakness. It means at some point, being acknowledged became the only way you knew you existed. So when acknowledgement disappears, your ground disappears with it. That's why silence feels louder than words. Words engage you. Silence forces you to stand alone. And if you don't yet trust yourself to stand there, quiet will feel unbearable. This doesn't mean you should tolerate being ignored. It doesn't mean silence is healthy or acceptable. It means the pain you feel is information. It's pointing directly to the place where your worth is still waiting for permission. Permission to matter, permission to be chosen, permission to take up space without an audience. Here's the line most people never cross. Silence stops hurting when it stops defining you. When you no longer treat quiet as judgment. When you stop asking absence to tell you who you are. Because silence is empty. And emptiness only hurts when you expect it to fill something you refuse to hold yourself. This isn't about becoming cold, or detached, or pretending you don't care. It's about becoming anchored. So when someone goes quiet, you don't collapse inward. You notice the absence, you feel the discomfort, but you don't disappear with it, because your existence no longer depends on being answered. That's the real work behind silence. Not forcing people to speak, not numbing the ache, not chasing closure, but building a self that doesn't evaporate in the quiet. When you reach that point, silence loses its power, not because it stops happening, but because it no longer gets to decide what you're worth. And that's when something flips. Silence stops feeling like rejection, stops feeling like erasure. It becomes what it always was, a space. And this time, you don't wait for someone else to fill it. You stand in it, intact,